We last left off talking about the development of the Cold War, and one of the topics was the Korean War, some domestic communism that scared people, and this led people to lose trust in both President Harry Truman and the Democratic Party in general. When in 1952, hero of World War II Dwight Eisenhower ran on the Republican ticket, he wins resoundingly. This presentation continues discussing the development of the Cold War, specifically a policy known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, as well as the idea of the Domino Theory and mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. Have and have not nations. It's the idea that the first world is represented by developed and industrialized Western democracies, like the United States, Britain, and France. They can be seen on this map to the right in green. Second world nations are developing and still industrializing communist nations like the Soviet Union and its allies. And then third world nations are underdeveloped and unindustrial nations like those of Africa and South America at this time. Many people believe that one of the reasons that the Soviet Union and the United States had so much animosity was out of Soviet Union jealousy over the standard of living in the United States. One of President Eisenhower's campaign promises was to end the Korean War. He said throughout the campaign that it would be one of his top priorities. Shortly after taking office in 1953, a permanent truce was finally agreed to, going back to the original 38th parallel borders of North and South Korea. So this is a great example of a war that was not fought for total victory. There is no real winner or loser here. This war is fought only to contain Chinese and Soviet power. Again, the policy of containment. The Suez Crisis. In 1956, General Gamal Abdel Nasser asked the United States for help building a dam along the Upper Nile River to help irrigate desert land and provide electricity to thousands of Egyptians. The U.S. refuses because the Egyptians had an anti-Israel view. When we refused, the Egyptians turned to the Soviet Union. After receiving aid from the Soviets, the Egyptians choose to nationalize the Suez Canal. That means that it is no longer privately owned, it is owned by the Egyptian government. This is very much a move made by a communist country, and it makes sense because they had fallen under the influence of the Soviet Union. This is especially bothersome because the Suez Canal connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea and prevents traders and military personnel from various nations from moving between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean without having to go around the tip of Africa. The need for the Suez Canal on this side of the world is the same as the U.S. need for the Panama Canal during the period of American imperialism. Now, this canal system had originally been built and owned by the British and French, so naturally they're pretty mad when this happens. Hoping to regain control, the British and the French, with the help of Israel, attack Egypt. President Eisenhower is furious. He's furious mainly because he had not been consulted on such a major move, and he immediately criticizes the attack because he is worried that supporting this move could draw the United States into a broader conflict with the Warsaw Pact nations, especially the Soviet Union. With major pressure from Eisenhower and the U.S. State Department, the attackers withdraw and a major showdown with the Soviet Union is avoided. On the upper left, you can see General Nasser. On the bottom left, you can see him signing agreements with the Soviet Union. In the upper right, you can see a map showing just how much shorter it would be for a British trading vessel to use the Suez Canal to get to India rather than going all the way around the tip of Africa. And on the bottom right, you can see troop movements when the British, French, and Israelis invaded the Suez region. To avoid something like this from ever happening again, Eisenhower officially declares in 1957 that he would send U.S. troops to any Middle Eastern nation that was threatened by communism. This comes to be known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. The policy is first tested pretty quickly when the U.S. has to send troops into Lebanon to prevent a communist takeover. Like many foreign policies before him, Eisenhower was trying to get out in front of any future problems. The Domino Theory. President Eisenhower is presented with this theory by his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. It really means that if one nation fell to communism, surrounding nations might also fall due to the influence of the first nation to fall. An example would be if Vietnam was to fall to communism, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, the three surrounding nations, would also fall to communism. This theory is taken very, very seriously by President Eisenhower, who sends military aid to Vietnam. You can see a picture of him meeting with South Vietnamese officials during his presidency. Even furthering the commitment to Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization is created. This is all related to the domino theory and the fear that communism might spread throughout Southeast Asia. The U.S. gets Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, Thailand, and the Philippines to sign on to this agreement, hoping to avoid any further communist influence in Southeast Asia. In 1956, the Polish and Hungarians rise up against Soviet control. The Soviets, fearing that they can't really keep total control over the Polish, agree to scale back their control in Poland, but being confident that they can control Hungary, they put down the Hungarian Revolt by force. President Eisenhower really doesn't do anything about this, fearing that any action to support the Hungarians in Budapest would result in a broader NATO versus Warsaw war. In 1957, the Soviets launch a satellite named Sputnik into orbit, and immediately the United States freaks out. The public thinks this is opening up the ability for the Soviet Union to spy on the United States. In retrospect, what we know about Sputnik today is that it really had no abilities whatsoever. It was a satellite that would send a signal back down to Earth that it was still orbiting, and when looking up in the night sky, you could see a blinking light. This is really all that it was capable of doing. It was more of a test case for future satellites than anything else. Nonetheless, the U.S.-Soviet space race ensues. Both President Eisenhower and his successor, President Kennedy, support it. Kennedy even lays down the challenge to get a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. Throughout this time period, spending on science education increases to get out ahead of the Soviet Union in engineering and space travel. In 1960, a U.S. spy plane is shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot, named Gary Powers, is exchanged back to the U.S. for a Soviet spy. So both sides kind of get something out of the deal, but Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, cancels a summit conference with President Eisenhower, and Cold War tensions rise. This is especially worrisome to the United States because additional tension with the Soviet Union meant greater risk of massive retaliation. Secretary of State Dulles used strong language against the Soviets, saying that any NATO nations being attacked would result in what's called massive retaliation, meaning you send one missile at us, we will send 10 back at you. Although there's really never the direct threat of nuclear weapons being used, everyone knows what Secretary Dulles means. Oddly enough, it is the threat of massive retaliation that helps keep the peace, because when the two major sides of the Cold War both have enough nuclear weapons to obliterate the entire Earth multiple times over, neither side is going to want to be the one that started a nuclear war. This is called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This means that nuclear war would result in both nations, and probably the entire world, being absolutely destroyed. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back to the website and take the online quiz associated with this video. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.